The captain wired in he had water coming in, and the good ship and crew were in peril. Later that night, when his lights went out of sight, came the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario, and Superior. These are the names of the Great Lakes that separate the USA and Canada. Following out via the St. Lawrence River, freighter traffic across these lakes are basically quite heavy, exporting goods and businesses from the US states such as Wisconsin and Michigan. In fact, the freighters that have been specifically designed to ideally work within these lakes are known as lake freighters, or to be short, Lakers. Due to having to match the ore chutes at Marquette, Michigan, the first of this so-called Laker type featured a signature wheelhouse at the very front, with the engine and funnel at the very back, allowing for a hollowed-out hull between. As the designs changed through the years, one design has become famous worldwide, not because of the records it broke, but the disaster that would happen. This is the story of the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. In August 1957, from the shipyards of River Rouge, Michigan, the keel will be laid on what would be known as the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. At a cost of just below $60 million as of 2025, with a length of 223 meters, she would touch water in June 1958. However, the launching ceremony would not go without some issues. The first was that the signature wine bottle to break across an engine's hull, it didn't exactly break. And then when they launched it, because it was launched sideways, it just about went onto the other bank on the opposite side of the river. And it really could have gone horribly wrong. It could have ended up like that North Korean ship that they launched recently that tipped over immediately. Yeah, it would not have been good from the very start. She would be given a 25-year contract to operate over the Great Lakes hauling freight. The main freight that she would carry would be taconite, similar to bauxite, which are both able to be refined into pure iron, which can then be turned into steel. A typical journey would go from Superior, Wisconsin to Toledo, Ohio, although this isn't strictly set in stone depending upon the contract. Incidents wouldn't avoid her, with a grounding in 1969, a collision in 1970, and instances throughout 1973 and 1974 of striking the side of the Sioux Locks, separating Lake Superior and the next lake along the journey. And she lost her anchor in 1974. Over the 17 years of service, she would log enough miles to have travelled around the world 44 times. All this while within the Great Lakes area. On November 9th, 1975, at roughly 2:15 PM, the SS Fitzgerald would depart Superior for the last time, travelling to a steel mill near Detroit, full with just over 26,000 metric tons of taconite ore. The November gales across the Great Lakes are famous, with storms happening quite often during this period. A typical path Lakers took in these conditions would be to skirt around the northern side of the lakes, with Lake Superior being the one that troubled sailors the most. With another boat, the Arthur M. Anderson, the Fitzgerald would try to make a semi-direct passage towards the northern shore of the lakes, passing to the south of Isle Royale. Both ships were in constant radio communications, taking slightly different routes to get to the Sioux Locks to enter the next lake. All was fine until 1 AM on November the 10th, when the Fitzgerald would encounter winds of 60 miles per hour with 3-meter swells. Through the night both ships went, being able to slightly see each other through the storm. This was until about 2:45 PM, when the faster moving Fitzgerald began to pull away and snow would begin to fall. Radio chatter was still held, with the nearby Wilfred Sykes hearing all the conversations, as most Lakers typically did. And this is where the troubles would start for the Fitzgerald, as the captain would radio the Anderson to report that 2 vent covers had been lost, with a slight list occurring, which indicated that water was being taken aboard at roughly 3:30 PM. The Fitzgerald would slow to try and get the Anderson to catch up, should ship abandonment need to occur. Word then came over the radio that the Sioux Locks were closed, and all ships should try to find anchorage to wait out the storm. At 14 PM, the Fitzgerald would report of losing its radar, trying to get the Anderson to basically be its eyes and ears. With help, both ships began to try to steam towards Whitefish Bay, close to the logs, but sheltered enough to pass the storm. But another problem arose. The lighthouse and navigation aids near Whitefish Bay were basically inactive, as the captain would radio the US Coast Guard to ask why he could not see them at roughly 4:39 PM. The captain of the Aberforth would be in contact with the Fitzgerald, and the captain would later hear the Fitzgerald captain mention, "Don't let anyone on deck." Then, the Fitzgerald would then herald and say it had lost both radars and was taking on water. This was a very, very bad sign. And it got even worse, as by 6 PM, the waves were over 7 meters high, with the 60-mile-per-hour winds not relenting at all. At roughly 17 PM, the last radio message between the Fitzgerald and anyone else would occur, with the captain saying, and I quote, "We're holding our own." 10 minutes later, however, the Anderson would lose all radar and radio contact. Not a single distress message had been sent. We will divulge from the search efforts, as quite frankly that story is quite insane on how long they tried to search for it, but I will note that the Anderson was one of the ships that was trying to find the Fitzgerald while the storm was ongoing, and I salute them for that. They did not have to try and find them, but they willingly tried to. Only debris, lifeboats and rafts were found belonging to the Fitzgerald, but there was no one in those rafts. They were just floating adrift. On November 14th, 1975, a plane with a magnetic anomaly detector would find a very large reading only 8 miles northwest of the nearest sheltered spot. But what seemed like a very large single reading would end up becoming 2 large readings. On submersible dives in the following months, this reading would be confirmed as the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, with the ship having been broken into 2 sections. All 29 crew members were dead. The ship was at a depth of 77 meters. This is where the theories of the ship sinking would occur, with 3 main theories being thrown around, but none of them being fully conclusive. Lake Superior had a habit of throwing rogue waves at unsuspecting ships sometimes, so it is possible that a series of rogue waves had potentially hit the ship enough to send it under, with the momentum carrying it under to the point of being unable to ascend. This is possible as there was no distress signal ever given. With a test and scale model done to show this, it is likely that this did happen, but it doesn't really explain why the ship's hull broke like this, if it all kind of went under at maybe a 10-degree angle. The second theory is that because some of the holes were being opened to the elements, as the waves crashed over, the ship had taken on more water, and like the MV Derbyshire would show in 1980, basically kind of just carried it under in the middle. This is possible and not possible, as the holds may not have been closed fully to begin with. This was basically kind of typical practice to alleviate dust and such from the ore, but even then, this doesn't explain how the ship could have sunk almost immediately, as the holes would have caused the ship to sink stern first, with at least a little bit of warning for the crew. The final theory, and the one that I believe the most, is that the ship broke in half on the water surface. It isn't uncommon for ships to break in half, with many ships in history having done so. The theory stemmed from the way that the Fitzgerald had been built, with welded sections being the norm, as opposed to the standard riveting section. It is possible that between swells, the ship's stress tore it in 2. This is plausible, as this could explain a sudden loss of power to knock out the radio, causing no emergency signal to have been given. The waves were quite strong, and the gaps between them could have caused the ship to bend around the middle, and then it eventually gave way. It should be noted that with all of these theories, the ship either broke on the surface, on its way down to the seabed, or after hitting the sea floor. So that's technically 9 theories on top of it, but we're just going to keep things simple and just present these 3 theories. And don't take my word as fact. It should be noted that the various reports come to different conclusions, so it is uncertain officially the exact cause of the sinking. Many changes were undertaken, one notable one involving ship captains. After the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, and while it wasn't set in stone, the general rule of thumb was that when the November gales came, you would just drop anchor immediately. Like, don't even try to find shelter, just drop anchor, stop, rather than continuing to try and sail into the storm. Another notable safety change was that in 1977, all ships above 1600 tons had to use depth finders, as this wasn't exactly a requirement at the time. This was possibly due to how the Whitefish Bay is deeper, and that's why the Fitzgerald tried to make it there, as opposed to heading towards the northern side of Lake Superior, where depth readings are shallow at best and unknown at worst. The ship's bell and anchor were recovered, being on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum and Great Lakes Museum, respectively, with the bell having been recovered in 1995. Interestingly, the anchor is not the one from the ship that sank, but from the one that the Fitzgerald had lost back in 1974, this one having been recovered in 1992. For several years until 2006, the Mariners Church of Detroit rang out the bell 29 times to remember those that were lost in the wreck, with famously on May 2nd, 2023, where the bells would ring 30 times. That extra ring had been because of a man who had incidentally caused the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald to be far more widespread. We have to rewind a bit to just a few months after the sinking, when Ontario singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot would see a newspaper article calling the ship the Edmund Fitzgerald, as opposed to the Edmund Fitzgerald. Apparently he was so upset at the memory of the men having been desecrated by this typo, that he would write and perform a song that was simply called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The song is a very poignant piece, telling a very sad story. It should be noted that some parts of the songs are outdated. There's new information being sung during performances, basically. Like when he's singing live, he will then change some of the lyrics. But the original 1976 version is the most common listened to one, and the one that I preferred. While slightly outdated, is surprisingly accurate to the version of events. We've got mentions of the 26,000 tons of ore, the path it took, the worsening conditions, how everything went catastrophically wrong, and then the detail of the ringing of the bells at the Mariners' Church being a very poignant way to round out the end of the song. When Gordon Lightfoot passed away on May 1st, 2023, the next day the Mariners' Church rang out the bells. A very fitting way, for he was one of the main reasons as to why the Edmund Fitzgerald is remembered, and the November Gales are known forevermore. It has been 50 years to the day when the ship went under, and a ship still passed through the Great Lakes area carrying the iron ore. It is important to remember not just those of the Fitzgerald, but to all those that have perished on the Great Lakes, especially those on Lake Superior, the lake that doesn't give up its dead. This has been TBLMallet38. Like, share, subscribe, comment, do the things that YouTube tells me to tell you, and I shall see you in the next video. Goodbye. If you would like to watch a previous video, click here, or if you would like to watch a recommended video, click here, or just let the video end. The choice is yours.